me a minute. We're going to get started here with you. So welcome to the webinar. My name is Tommaso Johnson. I'm the Public Policy Director at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We are really thrilled to have you join us this morning. We've got an exciting presentation from a couple folks who are doing great work in our state and in our communities to address violence and work with survivors in several different capacities. So I'm going to hand it off to Martina Cartman and Priya Rai in a moment here to get the webinar going. I wanted to first just say that we're appreciative of the support of Washington State Department of Commerce, Office of Crime Victim Advocacy for providing funding that helps this webinar in part take place. I wanted to just say off the bat that this webinar is intended to present some good work that's happening in the community with survivors relating to accountability and violence, and it doesn't nothing you're going to hear in the webinar today necessarily reflects the views of OCVA or any of our other WSCADV funders, but we're presenting it here because we think it's really valuable work and it's important to inform your work with survivors across our state. So on that note, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, and I'm going to hand it off to Martina and Priya. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. So we thought we would introduce ourselves instead of having Tommaso do it. So my name is Priya Rai, and I am a community organizer at API Chaya, which is an organization here in Seattle that works with Asian, South Asian, Pacific Islander survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking, and broadly immigrant and communities of color working to build power. I come to this work as a survivor, as someone who's experienced a lot of harm from when I was really young in life all the way up through adulthood. And I think I really like to think about what are ways that we can truly confront violence when it happens. As somebody who, everyone who has ever caused me harm in my life is someone that I deeply love and am deeply connected to. And so the narratives of they're somebody who's a monster or they should be far away from me no matter what, it just never really made sense in my experiences with harm. And so I think, not consciously, but from when I was a tiny little baby, I was thinking about this stuff. And as I got older and started to understand some of the structures and systems that we have, I really wanted to dedicate myself to thinking about how can we actually transform ourselves, our families, and our communities in response to deep harm that happens. So I think that's kind of what brings me here today.
Hey folks, thank you to Tommaso and WSCADV. It's really wonderful to be with everyone who's joining us from across the state today. My name is Martina Cartman, and I work with an organization called the Community Justice Project, along with Davida Briscoe, who wasn't able to join us. She's our Survivor Network coordinator and is out this week, very ill. So we want to send her our love, and Priya and I will take the presentation on without her. My journey to this work is similarly fueled by my own experiences as a young person on both sides of harm. So initially as a survivor of domestic violence, and then very shortly after as an indigent defendant facing quite a long sentence. And while my experience was deeply painful and dehumanizing, what became very clear to me at a young age and has been confirmed over and over and over again as I continue on my work closely with people on both sides of harm, is that it absolutely pales in comparison to the experiences of poor folks and people of color and queer people who are targeted by and cycle through the criminal legal system every day. And so that really drives the kind of racial justice analysis that we have in the work that we do and our broader visions of liberation. And so with the Community Justice Project, and which we partner with API Chaya for, all of our work around healing and accountability is also at the intersection of examining systems that have contributed to historical harm and violence in our communities and continue to contribute to interpersonal violence today. So we're a group that lives in really deep questions and consistently grappling with what accountability can look like. And we're a group that has visions and dreams about a healing justice that really upholds the dignity and humanity of all people, and actually stop cycles of violence in our communities. So we'll talk a lot more about what that looks like on the ground and what the models we use are, but that's our general sort of grounding and underpinning. We're both really excited to be with you all and to share some of our thinking and our learning on restorative and transformative justice, and on broader healing justice frameworks, and to get to hear the questions that you all are in. So we have a question and answer box here. Feel free to ask questions along the way, like by typing them into that box, and we will stop and answer them if we can in the moment, and if not, we'll make sure to have some Q&A at the end. And before that, what we will do, just to tell you a little bit about where we're heading today, is we'll spend some time discussing current practices of addressing harm primarily through the criminal legal system and drawbacks of this approach. And then we'll get into some tensions and possibilities of other approaches, including restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability, and broader healing justice frameworks. Thank you. And then inside of that, Priya and I will both spend some time discussing sort of examples of the work that we're in, some practices that we use and models for really holding restorative justice and healing justice on the ground. And then we'll have time for Q&A more fully at the end. I think we're going to try to leave at least 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. All right.
Slide for this. No. Thank you, everybody. So we thought we would start by talking about first, like, what are the current ways that we are responding to harm, or what are some of the mainstream ways that we are responding to harm? Oh, hey, Tomas. Are you? Do you have something you want to ask me?
No, that's fine.
Okay, I'm just gonna keep going. You know, the primary way that survivors, or we are told to seek justice or to get repair, is through calling the police, right? Through prosecution, through prisons, and a criminal system. And historically, that is something that the anti-violence movement has really invested in. So, you know, many decades ago, the anti-violence movement organized and worked really hard to have domestic violence and sexual violence made into a crime. And there's a lot of power in that, of course, right? In naming something as violence when it wasn't even considered that before. And there also has been a lot of consequences in that being the primary way that we have invested in seeking justice. So, you know, in the 90s, I think, broad strokes, what we can think about is how when we are investing all of our money in an approach that is only exists after harm has already happened, we're already missing out on so much opportunity, right, of investing in the kinds of things that we know really can help prevent violence or really help survivors escape, right? So things like basic human needs, money for prevention work, and, you know, things like the Violence Against Women Act in the 90s, which was so important and has like led to a lot of important things that for our movement and for survivors. We actually saw that it was, you know, also tied up with a giant crime bill in the Clinton era, and so all of its funding is now tied up with a crime bill. And we saw that like $9.7 billion more went to prisons because of that. And at the same time, Clinton was working on welfare reform, you know, limiting the amount of welfare people can have, and putting in a lot of work requirements. And because of that, we saw the amount of people receiving welfare fell over 50%, and actually 6.5 million people less were on welfare every year. Less people were on welfare every year. And so we just saw, as we put so much money and we say this is how we are going to get justice for survivors, it's all through prisons, policing, and prosecution, we actually, at the same time, right, that means there's not money going to a lot of the other things that we know can help survivors and can help prevent harm in the first place. And so I think also broadly that looked like professionalization of a lot of services. And so we saw community-based services or investment in families and communities responding to harm became kind of delegitimized or certainly not funded, right? We thought, okay, now you have to go to a professional to help. You have to call a helpline and go to an anonymous shelter. And we moved away from solutions where the community truly could confront what was going on and actually like say, no, we want the survivor to stay, and we want to confront this harm in a real way. You know, we also see that the state perpetuates lots and lots of violence against folks, and often that gets invisibilized. I think that's becoming more and more part of the conversation today, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those ways that that happens. So, you know, I think broadly, this investment has had great consequences for our movement and also for survivors. And also that marginalized communities have been, who have never really relied on those state systems, have been working to develop alternative ways forever, since the beginning of time too. So we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into both of those areas. Pass it back to Martina.
Thank you, Priya. So Priya chatted a little bit about one of the primary approaches that we've really invested in to address interpersonal violence, and that is criminalization. And so when we think about the amount of resources that are going into criminalization, it's not just sort of the system of imprisonment itself, but also all of the systems that feed that, right? So probationary services, pretrial services, court programs, prosecutors' offices, defense attorneys' offices, and the like, police units. And in many ways that approach makes sense, right? There's some ways in which it can really address sort of the short-term needs of survivors, and there's other ways in which it causes serious harm. And so what Priya and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is really what are the actual impacts of criminalization and the impacts of the level of investment that we have had in that particular response. And so often when you hear people talk about mass incarceration and criminalization, you hear it from the perspective of folks who've caused harm and real concerns about sort of the dignity and humanity and human rights violations that are wrapped up in the justice system. And what we hear less often is a real reckoning with the ways in which it has failed survivors. And so Priya and I want to spend a little time talking about that first. So I think it's important to note that most survivors opt out of the criminal legal system to begin with. So more than half of people who experience harm, experience actual injury, contact 911 to begin with. The exact numbers is that 56% of cases in which a victim was injured go completely unreported. That means that fewer than half of us, when we're hurt, believe that the criminal justice system is better than nothing at all, right? Because often if it's not that, there's nothing. So more than half of us prefer nothing to what's currently being offered in the criminal legal system. And of those that do go through the justice system, after calling 911, first and foremost, most cases are not charged, right? So about half of cases of that half are actually charged, or an arrest follows. And of those that are, more than 90% result in a plea deal. And so the sort of request here is not necessarily that the criminal legal system take those crimes more seriously, but that we have more options for folks. And the question is, do you mean that more than half don't call 911? The answer is yes. So 56% of people who experience injury do not call 911 to begin with, and that's all forms of injury. So not necessarily tied up in domestic and sexual violence, but all forms of violence broadly. And that data remains true across demographics, which I think is interesting. Thanks for asking questions. Please continue to do so we can make sure that we provide information that's useful for y'all. So when we think about the experience of plea deals, right, and having that really outside of the hands of the person who's experienced harm, what we hear often with folks that we work with is that there are real needs for folks who experience harm, right, and that the experience of trauma and violence is fundamentally an experience of powerlessness. And then the experience of navigating the criminal legal system does little to actually counterbalance that with any degree of agency afforded to the person who's experienced harm. And so instead, survivors have almost no control over what is doled out, right? Whether that's punishment, whether that is nothing at all, and whether their needs are really going to be met. And so there's little support for trauma healing. There's little support for sort of root causes that might have landed a person in a situation to experience harm. And there's little support for long-term safety. So while there might be sort of short-term safety, that often leads to further harm down the line. And also so many of the services that are then provided are wrapped up in needs to cooperate and involve the criminal legal system. So what we're not seeing is sort of a decoupling of the responses that are really required for the people who've experienced harm in the criminal legal system. Do you want to add anything? In addition, many survivors are criminalized for trying to navigate their conditions of violence and abuse. And that happens in a number of ways. So one of the effects of stricter law and policy directing police to treat domestic violence and serious violent crime has been skyrocketing arrests for women and queer folks for domestic violence in particular, and sort of expands the net and web of folks who get caught up in the criminal legal system at all. And so when we're talking about the folks who are experiencing domestic violence, that's often mandatory arrest laws, which we have in Washington state, and particularly for populations that are marginalized and already over-policed, that really can lead to further harm. And regardless of the crime of conviction, so whether or not it is a person is incarcerated or arrested for a crime related to domestic violence, women who are incarcerated are likely to have experienced incredibly high rates of abuse prior to coming. So 86% of jailed women surveyed in 2015 nationally, and up to 98% in other surveys by the Restorative Justice found that the women reported a history of sexual and domestic victimization. 98% is also just the folks who reported. And I can tell you from my experience working with folks who are inside that I have yet to meet an individual who has not experienced serious harm before ending up in prison. Abuse is actually a better predictor of incarceration than any other factor. So it is the single most likely factor to land someone in prison and in jail. And that means that it is a better predictor of incarceration than education, than employment, and than race, all of which absolutely are compounded. Do you want to add it? Oh, yeah. All right, so we have a video that we wanted to play about Marissa Alexander, which many of you may be familiar with, and it sort of speaks to the broader issues of criminalizing survivors. Let's see if I can get this going.
Marissa Alexander is a survivor of domestic violence from Jacksonville, Florida. 9 days after giving birth to a premature child, she was confronted and threatened by her abusive estranged husband. In self-defense, she fired a single warning shot upwards into the ceiling to ward him off. She was arrested, jailed, prosecuted, and convicted of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon by a jury after only 12 minutes of deliberation. Prosecutors asked that she be sentenced under Florida's 1020 law, which meant that she would serve a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence. More people around the country began to organize around Marissa's case and demand her freedom when her story became known after George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin and wanted to invoke a stand your ground defense that was denied to Marissa. Her supporters helped publicize her case, held protests and events, raised funds for her legal defense, and supported her through her probation. Her case brought attention to the criminalization of domestic violence survivors who fight back against abusers. Grassroots organizing and good legal defense led to Marissa's case being overturned on a technicality. State's attorney Angela Corey decided to retry her case and threatened Marissa with 60 years in prison for defending her life. In November 2014, Marissa accepted a plea deal for time served, plus 65 more days in jail and 2 years of probation under house arrest. Marissa Alexander was finally released on January 27, 2017. She has founded the Marissa Alexander Project to advocate for other survivors of violence who are criminalized for survival. Many people like Marissa Alexander are in prisons all over the United States doing time for defending themselves and for surviving. Learn more about how you can support other campaigns for freedom and justice at the Survive and Punish website.
So I think we really wanted to highlight at least one example of how some survivors get criminalized, and Marissa's story is just one of like countless thousands of people who are incarcerated across our country, punished for just trying to defend themselves or navigate their conditions of violence, right? And I think I was still at API Chaya back when a few years ago when Marissa's case was getting some attention, and I think I noticed definitely that in general, anti-violence agencies across the state were not vocal about her. We weren't putting statements out, we weren't contributing to some of their defense campaigns. And I think some of the work we have been doing at API Chaya is thinking about like who gets to be considered a survivor, and really complicating the narrative of like, you know, what does it mean to survive, right? And moving away from the idea that there's anyone who's a perfect victim, and really understanding that like we all, like we live complex lives and we all do all kinds of things in the face of extreme violence. And I think one of the ways that investing so deeply in police and prisons as the frontline way to deal with this has led to a lot of folks that I think otherwise we would really be helping, that we try to distance ourselves from. And so I think I really encourage us all to think more about like which survivors are we leaving out in our work day to day.
Thanks, Priya. I think to add to that, something that we hear a lot in our work, both with folks who are incarcerated and also with a group of people that we've been working with over the past year who have survived serious violence and are currently in a sort of restorative justice circle process with us, is that just the word survivor or victim doesn't even resonate. And so what we've done is we've asked people in those spaces, and Davida, I wish she was here, would talk a lot about this, but we've asked people, you know, do you identify as a victim or survivor? And they say, no, absolutely not. And then when we ask sort of, you know, what brought you here? And the answers are like, I lost my son to gun violence. I myself have been shot and survived, or I experienced domestic violence or a lot of violence in my home growing up. And I was abused in the foster care system, or like all of the things that for folks who are in the anti-violence movement would very clearly identify as survivorship. And that word doesn't even resonate, right? And so many of the folks that we're working with are Black and brown folks who are also criminalized, and the narratives they're getting about, you know, that's just life. And that sort of the difference of that, and then the image that we have nationally about who a perfect victim really is. And I think that one of the things that we're really interested in doing is shifting that narrative, because if we really were to center the people that are the most likely to experience harm, and we were to center the people that are the least served by our current services, then both our policies, our practices, our criminal legal system, and our direct services would look really different than they do today. Got a question here. Are you planning to send out data behind this slide? Yeah, I'm happy to send out some data. Absolutely. So the other reason that we're thinking really deeply about criminalization as a frontline approach to violence is that we actually know that prisons just are not working, right? So they are not actually delivering on the promise of safety that they were built. And so, and there's a number of reasons that we'll get more into, but things that lead to violence, the folks who are probably on this webinar and do anti-violence work know very clearly, is that there are many factors that lead to violence, right? So things like a culture and norm of violence, right? That includes objectification of women, homophobia, racial tensions, also shame, isolation, exposure to violence, an inability to meet one's economic needs. These are all primary drivers of violence. And then what our prisons do is literally bake in the very factors that lead to violence into their institutions, right? And so prison doesn't deliver on the safety and security of promises, even in cases of extreme violence. Instead, what we see is that lengthy incarceration exacerbates the very conditions that lead to crime. So conviction and incarceration result in barriers to occupational opportunities, to student loans, to public assistance, to Section 8 housing. They promote isolation and shame, right? So the sort of the level of isolation and shame that exists in our current prison system is astounding. And they increase prisoners' exposure to violence and trauma. And we'll talk more about that in a bit, but prison itself is really a major site of violence. And for those that were at the convening at King County Coalition Ending Gender-Based Violence, we talked a bit about a case here in Washington where a group of prisoners at Washington Correction Center for Women, that's in Purdy near Gig Harbor, filed a lawsuit with Columbia Legal Services against former corrections secretary, his name was Harold Clark, in 2007. It was settled by consent decree and determined that their complaints were founded. And the women alleged sexual assault by staff. They alleged that those sexual assaults were rampant. Prisoners who complained about sexual assault had to report that violence, oftentimes to the very officers that were causing harm, and if not, to their friends, right, and coworkers. and to the very institution that that harm was happening in. And then what often happened was either nothing at all, or retaliation, or women were subject to lie detector tests but not given a rape kit. And so the sort of like the way in which the folks who were incarcerated, often for surviving violence or activities that they were engaging in the course of surviving violence, then are subject to significantly more violence once they got there, and not given any resources or support, right? And we think about like the sort of perfect victim trope and how that plays out in this case. And so when women, what happened in Washington is by no means unique. It's sort of representative of what happens across the board nationally, what we see in our county jails and in our prisons in every state in the United States. And once women, almost all of whom were victims before they arrived, are arrested, and once they've gotten to prison, that abuse really does not stop. There's a really well-established pattern of police officers committing rape and sexual assault against those they arrest. Sexual misconduct is the second most commonly reported form of police misconduct after abuse of force, and you don't hear about that as often, right? There was a 2015 investigation by the Buffalo News that concluded that an officer is accused of sexual misconduct every 5 days. And then those are the folks that we resource and ask to come respond to violence, right? And in prison, rape is an absolute epidemic. So I talked a little bit about the case in Washington, but there's an estimated 200,000 people in the US that are subjected to sexual violence in prisons. I think that's annually. And so we think about the kinds of things that lead people to harm, and there's starting to be a lot more analysis and clarity around experiencing violence and trauma and abuse as one of those primary factors. And then we bake that into the very system that is meant to hold people accountable, right? So abuse brings women back to prison, and more abuse in prison ends folks back in the prison themselves. And the other reason that it does not reduce violence is that prisons are just sort of a blunt force response. It's a tool, one particular tool to address violence that doesn't actually do anything to combat root causes, right? And so, so addressing the impacts of violence and trauma require us to really deeply do the work of healing trauma and to do the work of addressing inequalities. And we actually need to be able to guarantee to people that a society is able to hold them safely, right? So that means that everyone has access to healthcare, to equity, to freedom from violence. And we know that we're really, really far away from that right now. We're not living in social conditions that make that possible currently. And so we think of these as mutually necessary parts of the project of anti-violence work. So we have to transform social norms, oppressive conditions that perpetuate violence. Currently, state-based responses to violence, including the criminal legal system, including sort of everything from immigration, CPS and the child welfare system, they not only like fail to deliver on the promise of safety, but they actually perpetuate it, right? They actually set us up for many, many injustices. And so just to break that down, if we're seeing sort of individual violence and acts of harm solely as individual violence and acts of harm, and we're not thinking about sort of the collective origins that impact violence, then we're also not delivering responses that can hold broader root causes, right? So we have to work to meet the immediate needs of direct people who've been impacted by violence and the immediate needs of folks who've caused harm, but also not leave out the huge network of people and systems that contributed to creating a context for that violence. So we're going to get into a little bit about approaches to other forms of violence, but I'm wondering if folks want to take a little bit of time, if anyone has questions right now, before we switch gears to talk about next steps and possibilities and tensions with healing justice. If you have any questions about what we've talked about so far, feel free to log them in the Zoom webinar chat, and we'll make sure to spend some time answering them before we move on.
We'll leave a minute or so and see if anybody hops on that. And I think just to wrap up that section, as we think about we've kind of taken a step back and we're looking broad strokes at the big picture and also how it affects individuals, right? And I think we can look at overall just rates of domestic and sexual violence have never gone down, and so we know in the big picture this isn't a solution, right? And I think, it feels really important for Martina and I to be clear that it's we are all about more options for survivors. So if this is currently working for you and you felt really good about your your criminal process and calling the police, and that worked well for you, that's the best. Like, all we have is the most limited options. So we support you in whatever choice you make. And what we wanted to talk about is all the people who we know it's not working for, and then focus on some options. But really, like, our number one thing is we want more to increase the options that survivors have, because we all know how limited they are.
Yeah.
Okay, we saw a couple chat things, so we're gonna.
Yeah. Do you want to read the chats and then we'll answer?
Sure. So you mentioned statistics that reflected violence taking place every 5 days. Do we know what is being done to combat the prevalence of violence taking place? If there is anything being done? And I think that is specifically with police officers that we talked about, right?
Yeah. That statistic is in regards to police officers, and it came from the Buffalo News article that came out in, I think, 3 years ago. And such a good question. We're not doing much. There are movements, right? Like, there's sort of broad movements happening nationally and in various, I think Chicago had a lot of work a couple years ago around police sexual violence. And so there's been various campaigns happening on the ground that have propped up. I don't know that there has been, I guess what I would love to see would be some more concerted efforts that really bridge folks that are concerned about anti-violence and feminist organizations with the communities that have been sort of organizing against police violence for a really long time. And I don't know that we've seen that happen much locally. Do you have much to add to that?
No, I think that's, I think that's exactly right. You know, in my experience, a lot of times anti-violence organizations operate totally independently from, like, racial justice organizations and or folks working on police reform efforts or shifting prisons. And that, I think, historically has been true pretty nationally, and, like, vice versa, right? Like, the organizations working to reform police and prisons are also organizations that often don't have a lot of information about domestic or sexual violence. So I think bridging that gap would be helpful for all of us overall.
Yeah.
I know that there was, like, a UN report done a few years ago about the amount that police officers in particular target sex workers because they're not believed. You know, some of the least believed group of people. So I think there's just so much there, and I don't think we are doing a lot. Yeah.
No, and I think the point that Priya just made around the sort of the organizations that have traditionally been kind of criminal justice or racial justice movements and the movements for anti-violence actually have so much in common, right? So the same communities that are the most likely to be incarcerated and arrested at disproportionate rates are also the same communities that are most likely to experience violence of all forms, right? And so we're really talking about the same populations, the same families. It's not at all unusual for someone to have, you know, one family member serving a life sentence and another family member who's going through the justice system as a victim of violence, or to be both of those things, right? And so the communities are the same, and really the needs are the same. The same things that we need to address the root causes of violence are the same things we need to address prisons and policing, right? Which is economic equality and a real culture shift around our views of individuals, right? So what we really think about people of color, queer folks, and women in this country. We do a lot to stop violence.
Breaking down gender norms.
Yep. And economic opportunity and education, right? So all of these things are sort of baked in to our current society, and it absolutely breeds violence, and it absolutely breeds further incarceration. And if other people have answers to that, we'd love you to post them up here. I know that wasn't a very specific one.
So another question is, can you say more about the root causes of violence that the prison system bakes into the experience? Isolation and shame, economic insecurity, and the other things that we talked about.
Such a good question. Yeah. Is the question sort of how it's baked into the prison system?
That's how I'm reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, so many ways. I guess I'll start with economic insecurity, because I think that is sort of the easiest lift. So oftentimes, right, the folks who end up in the carceral system are people who often haven't had a lot of economic opportunity to begin with. And then once incarcerated, or even just once arrested, right, that lands on your criminal record for the rest of your life. And we saddle people with what's called legal financial obligations, LFOs. So if you go through the justice system, you can be assessed LFOs for a number of things, including sort of identification, and you can be charged for your public defender, along with any damage, right? So if I steal a car and I crash that car, even if the person has insurance that covers it, I may owe $25,000 for the car. And then in Washington State, we have a 12% interest rate. And so that just accrues, that number just grows and grows and grows. And then someone may get released, you know, have gone into prison with $2,000 in debt and get released with $20,000 because of that interest rate and the inability to pay while you're incarcerated, and then go back to a community with the same conditions that landed them in prison to begin with and be expected to find a job and get their life on, quote unquote, on track. And now they have a criminal record that makes it very difficult to find employment. It makes it very difficult to have, to get housing and stability. It excludes you from all kinds of licensing, right? Like you can't get, I think in Washington, you can't get your barber's license if you have a felony conviction. And then you're sort of expected to like, right, like get your life back on track. And there's so many barriers that make that almost impossible, including everything that I just named. And in Washington, I know that you can't get federal financial aid for school if you committed a crime while you were receiving financial aid. So like what I was arrested for would have excluded me from the ability to complete my education because it made it impossible for me to get financial aid. So those are all the things that sort of we talk about when we talk about inequalities and access to economic opportunity. And I think some of the other things that were listed is isolation and shame. So I guess I'll speak from my personal experience a little bit with this, but one of the things that happens in the justice system, right, is like the very language that's used every step of the way, from the point of arrest to the experience of being incarcerated and the way that you're treated by guards and DOC administration, to the way that you're treated in the community if you have a record, right, all breeds shame. It's really about individual responsibility and not a lot of sort of narratives for rehabilitation. And where those narratives do exist, my experience of them was that it required you to say that, I'm trying to think how to word this, like everything was all your fault, and that you were somehow like had poor character, and that now that has been redeemed, as opposed to really being able to grapple with and wrestle with all the conditions that might have led someone to causing harm, and being able to hold all those complexities, right? And so there's so much shame that is breeded in that. There's so much sort of internal self-worth that is stripped of a person who's experienced that wildly dehumanizing experience. Things in prison like strip searches are very common, right? Anytime you go visit your family, if you have a family visit, you have to be strip searched on your way out and back. The way that the guards speak to people, right? Like all of these things breed significantly more shame than what someone may have already been carrying.
We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but that actually has just an inverse relationship with accountability.
Yeah.
And I think that's been clear to us as we've been diving into this work with people. And I think I'll only also just say a little bit about kind of shame and isolation that might come from a survivor side in a criminal process, which I think is probably something we're all a lot more familiar with, so I won't spend as much time on it. But thinking about, right, like you're not named in the case, you're like a witness. So what you want is maybe considered or maybe it's not considered, right? That really kind of depends on the particular detectives and the particular prosecutor that you're working with.
Yep.
So maybe, maybe not that what you want is actually considered, right? So I think at API Chaya, we see sometimes, you know, people might call 911 because they want safety in that moment, but they don't want their partner deported or sent to prison for a long time. And that's not always considered. And I think, right, like we know how re-traumatizing it is and how much shame comes up for people when having to like recount really horrible acts of violence. And I, in my many years long, very abusive relationship, I never even considered calling the police, really. And a lot of what was going through my head too was like, but you've done this, Priya, and you did this. And now I know, right, it's like the context of survival, which is really common for people, but I had in my head, it's like, you're just as messed up. Like, you have no right to call the police because, like, you did this other time, you know? And I think there's just so much, like, self-blame happening in those moments. And, you know, as we know in domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy, like, it's all about the self-determination of the people that we're working with, and, like, really helping them reclaim power again and finding agency. And I think in what I have seen with folks, like that has often not been the experience of survivors in working with the system too. So I think on either end, it's can be really hard and a lot of shame and isolation happens.
Yeah. And the last thing we'll say in response to that question around sort of isolation and violence in prison is also that, so there's literally physical isolation, right? So Washington State prisons does use solitary confinement. Someone just noted that the audio is a little spotty. Is that experience something that everyone is hearing?
If so, we'll tap in Tommaso, because that's not Martina and I's strong suit to fix those things. Let us know. Fine for me.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let us know if that the screen sometimes. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Just keep us up to date.
Okay.
Okay.
So Washington does use solitary confinement. For many years, that was used for protection, right? So if a young person, if a juvenile was sentenced as an adult and serving time in adult prison because they were auto-declined, then they would serve that time in solitary confinement until they turned 18 and were able to be in the adult facility, right? So we're saying to young people in that case, the crime you committed is so violent that we can't put you in juvenile, and when we put you in adult, you're not safe, so you'll just sit in solitary confinement for years and years on end. That practice has recently been changed by policy, and we'll see if that is being followed. And people are also put in solitary for all kinds of things that they could be accused of, and that solitary confinement is where someone waits while that accusation is being investigated. So not even once it's been confirmed, but while the Department of Corrections is investigating, a person could just be sitting in solitary confinement. And there's I think, I don't want to misquote it, but there's a time period with which that can happen. So I think it's about 2 weeks. And the experience of solitary is, it has been noted as a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in many countries do not use it, but the United States uses it pretty commonly.
I think, what is it, after 9 days, I think they consider it torture.
Yeah. And then there's also the isolating factors of being incarcerated far away from your family and your support systems, right? So when a person is incarcerated, I was incarcerated in a different state, for instance, it was a federal crime, and in a jail in a different state, and had not one person that I knew nearby, nobody that I could interact with in any way that was able to support me. And I think that's the experience that many people have, right? So separation from family, from their children, often in the women's prison, that's often the case, is that if a woman has children, she has to rely on a family member to take care of them and bring them to visit. And if that's not the case, then oftentimes CPS and child welfare system gets involved, and she may or may not see them ever again. And so we talk about sort of like all of those things that we really need when we want communities free from violence. And so much of that is about a thriving community, right? It's about people who know each other, who have deep relationship. It's about access to things that make your life safe and stable. And then those are really baked into the system itself.
Mm-hmm. And, I think at the end of the day, like, we really, doing this work, I think we all know that we can't, it's not just like bad people or monsters who cause this harm, right? This is one of the most common forms of violence that happens in the world. And so, like, just removing quote unquote bad people from our communities, like, I think that kind of feels good, right? Like, that if that was true and it was that easy, like, that actually feels really good to me. Sometimes I really wish that was true, like, genuinely, because the weight of all this harm and trauma it's tough. And honestly, it's like causes me a lot of anger. And like, that's just not the reality. So knowing that these are folks who are going to like get back out and be in our communities again, and knowing how many of them are survivors themselves, like, what else is actually possible in that space?
Yeah, there's some really great comments and questions here about the New Zealand model, which I'd love to answer that and talk about a little bit more when we talk about options, because I do have lots of thoughts on it. And then there's a comment about the disconnect between sort of racial justice and anti-violence movements, and also being who the face of those are, right? So the comment here is that anti-violence movements and feminist movements often have, whether this is true or not, right, have a sort of typically white woman as the face of the movements, and folks in the fight for police reform and racial justice are typically reflective of the communities that are most marginalized. So that's queer folks, trans folks, folks of color, thinking the anti-violence movement and feminist movements, because predominantly represent white women and exclude other communities, don't see the connections that other people might see more clearly around police reform and racial justice. I think that's absolutely true. Yeah. Thank you for those comments and questions, and we're going to come back to the New Zealand one shortly.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that is also a great transition into, so what else can we do then? You know, if those things aren't, you know, broad strokes working, or they're not working for a lot of survivors, like actually what else is possible, right? And so I would encourage folks, and we can drop the link in the chat at the end of the webinar, is a short description from Mia Mingus, kind of about what are some other ways we can deal with harm. It's maybe 3 pages, and I think it lays it out really well, so we'll share that with you. And you know, I think in general, there are so many models of other ways to deal with harm. Some are more formal, like formal restorative justice programs that get state funding or operate in state facilities, and some are more informal. Right, there are a lot of different terms or names for these other ways to deal with harm. You might have heard restorative justice, you might have heard transformative justice, community accountability. You know, for some folks, the differences between these terms reflect like deep political and ideological differences, and for others, they use them interchangeably. And you know, what we do know is that these community-based or healing responses to harm have been created and been happening forever in marginalized communities. So much like the comment we just read, right? It's like Indigenous communities, Black communities, immigrant communities, communities of color, poor folks, people with disabilities, sex workers, queer and trans folks of color, right? Those people have been doing this work forever, in big ways and in small ways for generations, right? Trying to just find safety and reduce harm in like the dangerous conditions and the oppressive conditions that we're all forced to live in, right? And they're all forced to live in. So we just want to make sure to like really lift up all the big and tiny ways that these kinds of responses has always been happening. And since there are so many terms and a lot of different models, like what we really want to focus on when we talk about these alternative ways is our values. What does it mean, and having a framework switch, right? Like what does it mean to truly address harm when it happens, right? Not just to punish people, not just to remove somebody, but to say like, what does it mean that this harm happened, and what does repair actually look like? And for us, that's a very value-based question, right? Because what we know is that we can't have a prescriptive response that is like, this is always the answer. But what we want is to create like flexible and resilient communities that have the skills and values to like be able to meet the variety of survivor needs that we see all the time. So we're going to talk a little bit about what our framework shift is into our values, and then go into a little bit of the specifics of some of the work that we have been doing.
We're going to start with a little bit about restorative justice, I think in part because there is quite a lot of material that has been written about it, and it really does set up the groundwork for a paradigm shift. And then inside of that conversation, I think transformative justice and broader healing justice frameworks are totally relevant. In some cases, they're like actually exactly the same, and then I think in other ones maybe a little bit different. And we're not going to get too much into the weeds of that, but really what we're hoping to do, as Priya said, is clarify what our values are, and that those values underpin our work regardless of kind of what we call it. So I want to start a little bit, this is adapted from Howard Zehr's work on, people may have read the Little Book of Restorative Justice, and he has for about 30 years, since around the 1970s, been working really deeply in restorative justice, both at the Eastern Mennonite University and also in communities across the nation. And so this is adapted from his work. He talks about this paradigm shift being really about fundamentally the questions that we ask and the values that underpin those questions. So with punitive justice, which is what we're currently operating under, right? The criminal legal system functions as a punitive model. There's a number of questions that are asked when harm happens. And the first one is, what laws have been broken? So those of you who do domestic violence work and sexual violence work probably know very clearly that so much of what happens in a relationship with patterns of power and control are not illegal, right? Like so many things that you or I might identify as violence is not legally identifiable as violence. And so we sort of wait until something happens that actually violates the law before action can be taken in many ways, right? Like when we're relying on the criminal legal system. So the first question is really, what laws have been broken? And I think in other contexts that question might just be like, what rules or regulations have been broken? Ultimately, it's about what codified kind of codified law has been broken. So in the school context, it's a rule, right? Or maybe in our workplaces, it's a rule. And then the second question we ask is, who did it, right? If we have no idea who did it, nothing's going to happen. If we know who we think is accountable, then further action might occur, right? So who did it is really a question of blameworthiness and whether or not we have proof to show that they did it. And lastly, we ask, what do they deserve? So in the RCW in Washington State, if there is a law, the next question then is what punishment is deserving, right? And so someone will go to trial to determine blame and guiltworthiness, and then they'll actually have a sentencing hearing separately to determine what punishment is carried because of that, right? So what do they deserve is the next question. We don't ask questions in here about crime victims, about people who've experienced harm. And then the second, if we're really like shifting from that punitive framework to a restorative one, what we then ask is, who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these, right? And those questions can be quite broad, right? So when we ask who has been hurt, we're not just asking about an individual, but more broadly, whether that is people that have witnessed that, whether it is family members, children, who's actually been hurt by a harm that occurred, and what are the needs of those folks? So what are the needs of the broader community? What are the needs of the people who witnessed the harm? And when we ask whose obligation is it, similarly, right, we're asking about that ripple effect. So who is the individual that maybe caused direct harm? And then outside of that, who are the people in that person's life, and who are the system players that set up the context for violence to occur, right? So it's a broader question and therefore triggers sort of a broader answer. So inside of those questions, there are a number of sort of presumptions, right? So when punitive justice model, when we ask that question of what law has been broken, what we're really saying is that crime is a violation of the law in the state, right? So you see on a charging document, your name versus Washington State or versus the United States government. It doesn't say, it's not like civil cases, right, where it's between actual individuals, so it's between you and the state. And violations create some kind of guilt, right? Like, so if it is determined that I'm blameworthy, then I'm guilty of that crime, and then that justice requires the state to determine whether or not that is the case, and to then impose punishment, right? So we're really asking the state in this case to come in and make a determination. In a restorative justice paradigm, we're saying that harm is a violation of people, it's a violation of relationships and obligations that we have to one another, right? So fundamentally now we're shifting from state and law to individuals and harm, right? And what that allows for is an expansion of what we consider harm to be, right? It's an expansion of the actual harm that can be acknowledged. And it's an expansion of a sort of conversation about what that violation brings. So violations create obligations is the second piece, right? Instead of creating guilt necessarily, they create obligations, right? So this is where we get into what accountability really looks like, and what actions have to be taken for accountability to occur. So we talk often about the experience of the criminal legal system as a passive experience. Someone can be arrested, they can go through a trial, they can spend time incarcerated, and they can come home and have done nothing to practice accountability, right? Because instead that's something that's happening to you. It's not creating an environment for someone to be invited into accountability. We'll talk a lot more about that later, but really this piece of obligation is about an action. And therefore justice involves everyone involved in an effort to address the harm, right? So both the individuals who maybe were directly involved, and also more broadly, the people in the systems that actually created the conditions that made that possible. And I think the piece around this that I find really useful is to really think about meeting the needs and obligations of the people who've been harmed as a participatory process, right? So it's a process of engagement. It's fundamentally about allowing space for agency, around for people to reclaim power, right? And the principle of engagement suggests that the folks who have been impacted actually have a significant role in determining what the next steps might be, right? And I think, and we'll talk again about this later as well, but this doesn't mean that something is totally survivor-led with no sort of safety measures in place, but instead that it's really survivor-centered. So we're really centering the people that have been harmed, and we're allowing an opportunity for them to be engaged in the next steps. Because restorative justice is a popular concept right now and can be used in various contexts. I think that it can be pretty convoluted, right? So you'll see all kinds of programs that say that they're restorative justice, community-based orgs, and system players, right, who are engaging in restorative justice as they name it, and I think that can get really confusing. And so if you are confused about what it is, that's because it's currently very confusing. So that's an accurate read of our movement. And so I find it really helpful to talk about what it's not, right? So much of what we see defining restorative justice is really about like funding, or it's about trying to like sell this as a particular program. And so I want to name that restorative justice is not only for minor offenses, right? And I put minor offenses in quotes because that's sort of the language of the state. But it happens, I think it often gets used for sort of minor harm because that's the easiest thing to get community support for, right? So when the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office engaged in their sort of initial experimentations with restorative justice, it was often for less serious harm, and that made a lot of sense given the sort of risk aversion of the office and the hopes that they could get people on board. And statistically, and sort of data that's happened, and research that's been carried out globally has shown over and over again that restorative justice has the most impact when harm is really serious. I think that makes a lot of sense when you think about sitting down with somebody who stole a candy bar from you and having an incredible amount of resources and support going into a dialogue when really that candy bar is not that important, and the person who stole it may have been just, stole it because they were 12 or because they couldn't afford it. And the sort of root of the issue is not going to be hashed out in a deep dialogue, right? So instead, when we think about what it means to sit in front of a person who you've caused harm to and account for that harm and witness the person describing the impact of that harm, or witness that person asking questions to you and having to answer those questions, and the harm is more serious, right, the impact is also more impactful. And so we'll talk again about that later, but it's really not intended for sort of minor harm. And I think primarily we're seeing that because of the hopes of popularizing the concept. So secondly, it's not the same thing as mediation. You hear those interchangeably quite a bit. And I just want to name that it's not exactly the same thing. So mediation often means that it's a facilitated encounter or dialogue between two individuals that are assumed to be relatively on a level playing field, and if not, that there's sort of a sense of some sort of negotiation or shared blame or an agreement that is meant to be reached that requires some kind of compromise, and that needs to be mediated by a third party. And what restorative justice is not is that. So restorative justice is really used in the context of harm that is one-sided, right? Like when someone has caused harm, another person has been deeply impacted by that harm, and they're coming together for many, many reasons. And that one reason that is not sort of the driving factor of restorative justice dialogue is that there will be a hope for compromise. And that's not it's not a requirement of a restorative justice process. I don't know that it's a good idea for a restorative justice process, though it's possible, and it's definitely not the long-term goal. It's also not about forgiveness. So another thing that you hear people talk about often is that forgiveness is either a prerequisite of a restorative justice process or that it is the ultimate goal, and it's not. So restorative justice, I think what it does is it provides a context where this might happen, and actually does happen much more frequently than in an adversarial setting of the criminal legal system. And the reason for that often is that, in a trial, or if it doesn't go that far, in a criminal legal proceeding, a person who's been harmed really has, if it's a harm by someone they don't know quite well, then it's really just this like stalled image of the person when the harm happened, and not a lot of information outside of that. And if it's a person that we do know quite well, what we know about them is not captured in the criminal legal system, and there isn't really an opportunity to hash that out and sift through, to sit in the fire of what happened. And so forgiveness, if it happens because an individual came to it on their own, but it's not sort of nurtured by our current criminal legal system. And what restorative justice does is create an opportunity for deep engagement, for deep dialogue, for deep question. And often people come out of that with a sense of healing and forgiveness, though it's by no means a requirement and it's by no means the goal. I think that we'll later talk a little bit about what our circles look like in the prisons that we work in. And this is a concept that we have to spend a lot of time on, in large part because the folks who've caused harm say over and over again that they feel forgiveness from the person who they've harmed is a necessary component to their own healing. It's a necessary component that is related to their accountability. It would be a necessary component for any kind of restorative justice, and we really have to name that that's not a requirement, and it's not something that you can ask of someone you've harmed, right? That it's actually not appropriate for a person who's caused harm to ask someone else to forgive them. That in many ways that is like actually taking away agency from a person who's been harmed again. The last thing that it's not is a panacea, right? So it's not the answer to our entire criminal legal system. Somebody named in the webinar chat that like all of the problems, both of violence in the world and also in the criminal legal system, can feel really overwhelming, and restorative justice is not the answer to everything. So it's not the thing that will necessarily address addiction and poverty and inequality. What it does do is create an opportunity for people to engage in trauma healing, in deep accountability, right, and an opportunity to address and maybe even organize in their communities against these broader systems of inequality, but it itself is not necessarily going to lead to all of those things. So we often hear like things similar to the minor offenses discussion, right? Like that restorative justice can be the answer to this and it can be the answer to that, and actually sometimes the answer to that is just maybe not charging that case, or maybe having more housing for folks who need it, right? Like actually having a fair wage in Seattle, that kind of thing. And so these four are also adapted from Howard Zehr in his little book of Restorative Justice. I know people have asked for resources, so if you're interested, pick that up, and he goes into a lot more detail. But I think he wrote that book quite a long time ago, and I would say that like all of these still remain so true, and it's so important to name to this day that sort of what it is and what it is not. So the other thing that it's not is it's not a map, right? Restorative justice is not a particular program, and I think that's something that folks often hope that it is, right? I think one of the things that is so great about the criminal justice system is that it gives these really specific rules that you know to follow, which human beings love to do, and restorative justice does not do that. So you're not going to find a pamphlet that says, you know, step one, this, and if A, then B, and if C, then D. Instead, what it is really a set of values and practices and skills to help you navigate messy human encounters and situations. And so I think what Howard Zehr also says is it's not a compass, or it's a compass, not a map, right? It is a set of ingredients, not the direct recipe. And so we talk about what those values are in our work. API Chaya and the Community Justice Project has come together to work on a number of restorative justice and transformative justice and healing justice initiatives, and have some shared values around those that we want to make sure we name. And so some of those here is that we're really thinking about moving from coercion and punishment to self and community accountability, right? So in this, what we're thinking about is like, what are ways that we can actually set up processes, we can actually set up conditions that invite people into a place of self accountability and really call into question what the community has done, right? And whether or not there's a level of accountability there. That we're really moving from solely individual harm and solely individual punishment to collective accountability more broadly, right? So this means that we're asking about family and friends, we're asking about the conditions that created violence, and that we are diving really deep into what accountability means in particular contexts. Do you want to add more to this later, or do you want to know?
I think later's good.
Okay. That we're also moving into a place of real self-sufficiency in our communities, right? So we know that so many first responders are the people that are closest to us, right? And I think Priya named this when she was describing some of her experiences with violence, and I think I had the same experience of navigating violence, and the first people that I called is a friend, right? Or my soccer coach, or my mother. Before I ever get to the place where I call 911, I call a lot of people around me. And so what we're thinking about in this work is how to really skill up the folks in our community to respond to harm in a way that both addresses the sort of initial needs of the people who are causing harm or being harmed, and also the long-term safety and healing and sort of strength of our communities. And I think some of this is about shifting the ways that we relate to one another in really small ways so that we're ready to address the big harms when they happen. And this, we referenced earlier, pre-reference that like a lot of this work has happened in communities that are marginalized for quite a long time. And I think it's also important to name that we're doing it every day, right? So like every day that we are talking to our loved ones about their relationships, that we're picking our friends up when they need us, like that is all small ways that we are really flexing the muscle of liberatory healing work and not relying on just a blunt instrument. Sure. This is also a picture in the slide of someone from our Survivor Advisory Board who's gone through the circle process with us, and one of our facilitators, Stacey Torres.
Thanks, Martina. So I think too, yeah, some of the, another value that I think we've talked a lot about in our collaborations is the idea of moving from, you know, the idea of justice, which I think, you know, I grew up really thinking that justice is very tied into prisons. Like that's the only association I ever had with that word, right? And I think part of our framework shift is like, what does justice actually mean for us? What does that mean in my survivorship, me as Priya? What do I think of as justice, right? And one of the things really came to is trying to center getting, not getting even, but getting well. And, you know, I think that means so many different things, right? It means not focusing on banishment as the main thing, but instead reintegration. Like, what would it look like to work with somebody to reintegrate them into society in a way where they can have loving and equitable relationships, where they can repair or work towards repair for the harm that they've caused, right? We don't even really provide people that opportunity. And I think it starts with, how do we think about the ways to address harm? How do we move instead of away from kicking out and instead think about drawing in? And, you know, I think for me, I think a lot about, there's a lot of push for tougher laws or longer sentences or more resources for police and prisons to respond to domestic and sexual violence. And I know for me, I often feel like I'm like, well, that wouldn't work for me. You know, like I'm a citizen of this country and I speak English as my native language. And I was in graduate school when I was in an abusive relationship. And I never once thought about, you know, calling the police. And a lot of things happen kind of in my name, right? In the name of survivors. And there are a lot of survivors who do want that. And I think, again, in honor of like more options and bringing all the voices into the room, you know, I really want to lift up the idea of getting well as something that I want to see from people who've caused harm from my perspective. And what that I think means is holding the dignity of everyone involved at the center. You know, understanding that the harm that you've caused doesn't mean that you don't have dignity as a human, which I think seems pretty basic and is actually a pretty big fundamental shift in the way that we have been thinking about things before. And so we're holding dignity and actually just the harm at the center. That is the main thing. We're thinking about, what is this harm? What is the impact of that harm? And what would a response that like actually holds us all mean and look like? And we are going to get into some specifics later. If you're like, that sounds cute, what does that mean? We are going to talk a little bit more about that. I think another piece then that is so important and is a huge part, I think, of API Chaya's work is also centering racial equity. And not just having it be something that is kind of like an add-on value that we work on later, which I know a lot of orgs are doing, and that's important work too, right? But it's not just like an add-on that we try to adapt our services to later. But if we actually plan them around the idea of racial equity, right, it would fundamentally shift the way that our systems and our services look today, right? It's just like the most marginalized people would be at the center, and that means like culturally relevant services are just the norm, right? They would be responsive to specific communities. We wouldn't have to beg people to have interpreters available or for language access. I mean, I think like the simplest things to the biggest things would really shift if we went to communities and we said like, what do you actually need? And we put our services around that, right? Like really understanding how systemic oppression ties into people's interpersonal experiences of violence. I think that would really shift the way we think about harm. And I think, you know, at the end of this, right, like what we're offering or what our models or these values mean to us is that what we can offer is the beginning of a healing process for everyone involved, right? It's not the be all and end all. It's not the answer to everything, but what we can do is say, like, we are going to center healing and offer an opportunity for everyone involved in this situation to heal. So again, cool, that's cute. What does that actually look like in action? And what are some models of this? And so, you know, we really think about this as this is a compass and not a map, right? We're really focusing on values and skills more than we're talking about particular steps in a process. Because, right, we want to be able to remain flexible and say all survivors need different things. All people who've caused harm need different things. And if we can hold these values at the center and build out processes and programs from that, we really like give ourselves the opportunity to remain flexible in that way and actually responsive to what people want and need. And I think, you know, an example of kind of what Martina was talking about around building up the skills of people in community, because before they call 911, before they ever call API CHIA or a crisis hotline, right, they're probably talking to someone in their life. And for a long time, API CHIA has had what we call the Natural Helpers Program. And it's based on exactly that idea, right? Like we know we turn to people already in our lives, friends, family, religious leaders, doctors, when we're experiencing harm. And what would it mean if we could skill those folks up to say, like, what would it take for all those folks to come together and say, I believe you, I support you, we do not condone this violence. I will talk to the person who harmed you and say, we do not as a community condone this violence and shifts need to happen, right? There's so much power there. And I think really some of the things we hold at the center too is like, what kind of work do we at API CHIA need to do so that we can build a world where our organization doesn't have to exist, where confidential hotlines don't have to exist, where shelters where people have to flee in the nighttime don't exist, right? Like, how are we holding that question too at the center, right? Because I'm hoping that we are all working towards a world where these issues don't have to exist in the same way that they do. And that's some of what we think about, how we think about that. And one of the ways that we are taking that on is through our collaboration with the Community Justice Project and a lot of brilliant partners around this work. Sure.
So we've been really lucky as a very, very small project to work closely with API CHIA and be supported by their staff and their both their skill and expertise and also resources to sort of pilot a project that we're doing in King County primarily, but in sort of the Pacific Northwest more generally. And so what that project currently looks like is that we sort of have a three-prong approach. So one of the things that we're doing is providing a circle process in currently Monroe Correctional Complex, Washington State Reformatory, with about 30 men and trans women who are incarcerated there, all for very serious harm and violence. That is a 15-month circle process where we just wrapped up actually. If you see bags under our eyes and exhaustion in our faces because we just finished a long, long process there at Monroe. So it was about 15 months and we met weekly for 2.5, 3.5 hours with a small circle. So there were 3 circles with about 10 people in each one. And inside of that circle, we explored, really it started off with accountability and what that looks like, trauma resilience, how trauma impacts our actions and what it means for accountability, like how the actual connection between healing trauma is connected to ensuring that our behavior moving forward is in line with our values. And resilience, so sort of really building up and strengthening our ability to stay present and connected and open to relationship, to support, shame versus guilt, and the connection between shame and what we actually see as not accountability, and a really grounded, rooted accountability that understands guilt as separate from total embodied shame. Talked a lot about equitable relationship skills, gender socialization, grief, loss, forgiveness, and how deeply related all of these topics are, and sort of how harm happens to be and what healing can be and what accountability can look like moving forward. And then along with that, we did some work with survivors in the community who were also very impacted by violence. We had about 12 people go through a circle process who sort of came to it voluntarily and because of connections that they had with our project, who lost their children to gun violence, who themselves survived gun violence, who were survivors of child sexual abuse and sexual violence and domestic violence, and some of who had many of those experiences. And they also went through a sort of mirrored circle process, and then we brought them into the prison, and there was some stories that were shared both ways. And then with those two pieces, what we're really trying to do is leverage the lessons we're learning for both broader policy change and also really to create more services that are in support of marginalized people who are impacted by violence. And we'll go a lot more into that. I'm going to hand it off to Priya to talk a little bit more about our work in the prison. And I also see that it looks like a couple other people have said that the audio was spotty. So I don't know if there's much we can do about that. I think we can try to slow down a bit in hopes that that helps catch everything that we're saying.
Thanks, Martina. So yeah, I think another thing that we've been thinking a lot about, or that has really like come to light in our 16 months together working on this project, actually it's much longer than that, but our 16 months going into the prison, has been like a really deeper understanding of what accountability actually means. Right? I think it's a word we love to use. I love to use it, and I think probably we would all have a different definition, right, of actually what that looks like. And so I think the Northwest Network here in Washington has done an incredible job talking about a lot of frameworks around accountability, and so we really encourage you to check out a lot of their work around that and their relationship skills class. And what they really talk about is that, you know, accountability is an ongoing process, right? It's not a destination. It's not like, boom, I'm an accountable person, period, right? Or even that the idea of like, I sat down with the person that I harmed, we had a dialogue, and now I have been accountable, period, right? Like, it's not a destination that you ever get to. It's an ongoing process that you are constantly engaging in your life, from the smallest things to the biggest things. I know, which we keep talking about, but right, that's how we build up our muscle to be able to handle the big things. And so what we saw is that, that's okay. And, you know, and some of what the network talks about too is that accountability means really being able to sit with the impact of what you, of the harm that you caused. Being able to demonstrate insight into how and why that harm happened and understand the impact in the end, right? And that includes kind of the structural issues that were involved in leading to that when that happened. So I think a lot of our work has been around like I don't know how to scroll. Sorry. Thank you. A lot of our work has been around what are the conditions then that make that possible, right? We have this great framework. You're like, okay, all I have to do is understand all the structural oppression of how and why I got to the place I caused that harm and all the personal trauma in my life. And, you know, I think the conditions that really require, like that are required to make that happen is like time, right? Time is such a huge one, which is why I know we kind of went over it fast, but it was like 3 hours a week for 16 months. Like, that's how often we were meeting together. And that is a huge amount of time, and we saw that that's like really what is required for these deep, deep transformational shifts to happen, which we definitely witnessed, and I think we needed that full time, you know, because we spent so long just doing community building, right? It's hard to come in, especially folks who have been in a prison setting for so long, who have been in a prison setting for so long. Like, we had to build relationships with each other. Our first step was like working on reconnecting with emotion. Right? Of saying like, it's okay to feel feelings, talking about healing not as feeling better, but about as getting better at feeling, right? And so what would it mean to invite those folks to actually be vulnerable, to cry for the first time sometime in many years, and right, how long it takes to actually get to that place. And I think another condition that was so important was like deep transparency and deep honesty. And I think that what that means is like being honest with ourselves and honest with each other when we're like, questioning folks and saying, I don't know if that like felt true or embodied, or it sounds like you have more work to do around this, right? And it's through our relationships and time together that those deep questions actually became possible. And so, right, when we think about like building skills to actually experience the range of emotions that we can sit in, right, that is necessary to actually feel and embody the impact of the harm that we've caused. And through that, like, we can have real empathy, right, when we are embodying that. I think it also has looked like demonstrating insight, right? So needing people to connect the dots between all the things that have happened in their life that led to that point. Because from my perspective as a survivor, it's like, you can't tell me you're committed to not causing that harm again if you haven't done all of the deep work that it takes to actually understand why did that harm happen in the first place. For me to tell you this is how you've hurt me, and to actually feel like that's real, right? To actually see that you feel that and that you understand that. And that took like so much deep work around trauma, around gender socialization. Let me tell you, it's really hard to talk to a bunch of men about toxic masculinity. We had a rough time with it. And they really came out the other side. Like at our graduation, like 9 people talked about toxic masculinity and how impactful it was to really learn how much that had controlled their life and their decisions. So there's like beautiful things that happen, and it's hard, right? We talk about restorative justice as like sitting in the fire, and I think that's often how it feels. And for us, I think we really came to understand like that is the necessary work towards being accountable. Like without actually putting in all that time and working to build your skills and working to understand that, like you can't actually, that is what accountability means. And I think it's been amazing to be able to like actually witness that happening, you know, and from my perspective, it's like, I've never been able to get accountability from most of the people that have harmed me. And it has been actually so healing to see people struggle through that process. Like nobody's perfect, nobody's gonna be perfect, but to see people genuinely trying, genuinely feeling remorse, genuinely putting in the time, effort, it is like, it has been so beautiful and so healing. And I know like all of the facilitators who went into the prison are survivors themselves. So I think I just really want to lift that up too. Like we are also a group of survivors who are saying like, that wasn't working for us. We deeply care about all community members, and like we think healing is not only necessary, but also possible. And I think like we've really seen some shifts in folks on the inside, right? Like crying more. So many people talked about like their relationships with their families getting better, them changing the way that they're doing parenting. And I think like, right, with time, with deep relationships, with like setting up the conditions where that's possible, like really actually causes shifts in people. Do you think, should I talk about accountability letters quick?
Yeah.
We wanted to give one example of the kinds of things that we were doing when we were sitting in circle, because I know that can feel kind of opaque. But in general, that, you know, it looks like we literally sit in circle together and we would go over some curriculum. So talking about what is accountability, what does that mean, what does that look like, you know, workshop-y style, talking about our personal experiences too. And then we would give folks a series of questions where they would go back and write about it. And then one by one, they would come back and they would literally read the things they had written on and share it with the group. And the group would hold space for them, ask questions, affirm them, you know, push them when needed. And so one of those things that we did is we call it an accountability letter. And it was, I think, 5 questions. So the first one is describe in detail the harm that you caused. The second question is, why do you think you caused that harm? Well, that's a deep question. Right, and that's an opportunity to talk about gender socialization and your own trauma and racism and like gang culture, like so many different things can be part of that, right? What has been the impact of that harm for the person you harmed, for their family, for their community, for you, for your family, for your community? And the last one is what could bring you healing and accountability, right? And so that's actually one of the earlier assignments that we did, right? And it gave a lot of such good information about like where are people at and what are they grappling with and how are they talking about the harm that they caused. And then we built upon that all year. And right, the idea of like, why did you cause this harm? How much that deepened over our many months together, right? How much more information people had about what that really meant and looked like. And I just want to say like, those are such deep and hard questions, right? And it felt deep and really difficult. And like people were willing to step into that space because there's such a deep desire to be accountable. Like I think we see that all the time on the inside. Like there's such a yearning for space to like try to grapple and repair. And I think people are willing to then do that really hard work after, even if it means going deep into the details of how and why, right? Not only the harm they caused, but then the harm that they themselves have experienced. And like being able to bridge those two things and see their connections is what really opens up the possibility of like making a different choice in the future.
Can I give an example of that?
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that Priya said that was really important about the accountability letters was that it sort of gave us a map of what the work would be in the future. So the accountability letter was the very first assignment we did, which some people warned us against, like, don't start with the hardest thing. And for us, it was really important to sort of get a feel for where people were at, both in terms of their accountability, but also more broadly, like kind of see the map of somebody's life and what that trajectory has been, so that we could figure out, right, so that we could remain flexible and provide sort of a response or curriculum and a space moving forward that would really hold what that was. So whether that was like deep grief for a person, or very clearly things around toxic masculinity, or very clearly about themselves being a survivor of sexual violence, right? Like all of that gave us a map to know what to do moving forward. I think just one example I wanted to name was that in our circle, a person, he specifically said, like, I don't think that that I really had any like issues with masculinity that related to my crime, right? So he was serving a long sentence for a crime he committed as a juvenile that was a drive-by shooting. And then when he told the story of what happened, one of the things that he said in there was he was not planning to go when people were getting in the car to leave, and then a family member said to him, like, basically, don't be a bitch about it, go. And he said immediately he hopped up, he grabbed his gun, and he got in the car. And when he read that letter, my co-facilitator and I, the other Priya at API Chaya, like, made eye contact with each other, you know, and we're very clearly tracking what that was about for him, and he was not tracking it, right? Like, he did not see that as a piece of the story that had much weight. And in the moment, we didn't get too deep into it, and we just sort of tracked for ourselves that this was an important thing to think about. And then, you know, 6 months later, when we got into the masculinity section and talked about his connection to violence, he finally, like, kind of rose his hand and came around and was like, I'm just realizing that, like, there was something inside of me that was so offended at being called something that was related to, like, women, that it literally made me, like, grab my gun and get in the car when I had no desire to be involved, right? So, like, all of a sudden this light bulb goes off for him, and he is a person who is not identified as someone who causes harm to women, or that because he's not in for domestic violence, he therefore doesn't have any work to do around masculinity. And all of a sudden there was an opening, right, to really think about the ties of masculinity and violence in all of its forms. And we really saw that play out for so many people throughout the year. So
yeah, I think the only thing I'll add to that too, sorry, now we're like excited, so we're going back and forth. I think that also, like, what's so powerful is that it was a group of folks together, right? So that light bulb moment for him could have been a light bulb moment for so many people, right? Or someone's question leads to a light bulb to somebody, which leads to a light bulb for somebody else, right? Like, we're all in that process together and struggling through the issues together. So people don't feel so alone, right? And everyone, like, and they don't feel like they're so singled out. It's like we can all grapple with this stuff together. And in that, like, our work progresses so much faster.
Yeah. So I'm just tracking that it's 11:30 and we're going to be wrapping up at noon, and I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So I'm going to really, really quickly talk about the survivor circle, and we'll have more time if people want to ask questions about it to go into it. And then we're going to briefly talk a little bit about some steps that anti-violence organizations can take to learn more and do more. There's so many models out there that we didn't get a chance to touch on today, and so we'll definitely send out resources. But I really briefly just wanted to name, since we took some time to talk about the accountability work that we did, to also name a little bit about our survivor circle. So what we have sort of in our curriculum is a section at the very end for the folks inside to get to sit with people who've caused harm and really witness their stories, and also an ask that a few of those folks share their own stories of accountability and healing. And so it was not directly with the people who they caused harm to, but sort of a surrogacy panel in a circle. And it was a day that people were, like, very nervous about. And we both felt like, you know, this is a time where a great, bold experimentation is important in this area, and also a time where we need to be really thoughtful and careful and intentional about how we hold space. And so what we did was we invited a group of folks to come together who were interested in this work and had themselves experienced harm, to sit in circle for a number of days. And I can't remember exactly how much time it was now, but it was about six or seven full days together over a period of months. So weekends here and there, in circle with 3 facilitators who all themselves are survivors as well, to really grapple with sort of what healing has looked like for them, similarly to what we did inside, right? Thinking about trauma healing, resilience, and survivorship. And then the offer, as they knew when they went into it, was made to go into the prison and to share their stories, and all but one decided that that was in service of their healing. And I think what I want to name around this is really that there was a number of reasons that people chose to be involved in this circle, and I don't think that we're in any way thinking that this is a circle that would be right for everybody all the time, but that it's part of like building out more tools and more responses and more services for folks who might be wanting to. And from the folks that we talked to that were interested in being involved in the circle, and we had many more people interested than we had capacity to hold, what we often heard were that people were interested and drawn toward restorative justice because they had answers to questions, and that even in a surrogate panel, while they might not be able to ask the person who harmed them directly, they had sort of broad questions about, why this kind of violence happens. People wanted to be really witnessed, and they wanted to be witnessed in both their pain, in the sort of impact of the harm, but also in their resilience and strength. So what I heard from a lot of the folks in our circles was like, I don't want to just be seen as a victim. I want people to see that I rose above, that I'm continuing to strive and to fight. People really wanted others to understand the impact of the harm, right? So really feeling like I experienced all of this harm, and what I can do is really leverage my own story in hopes that anyone who hears it will never cause this kind of harm again. So we heard that. And some people really wanted an apology, right? Like not necessarily from the direct person who caused them harm, but they wanted to hear from other folks in their community who were involved in a culture of violence that then led to harm, to really like take account for that. Right? And a lot of people really wanted to reclaim power and agency, like wanted an opportunity to be able to make choices about the way that they told their stories, to be able to make choices about the kinds of things they do in their own healing, and to really seek meaning, to be able to sort of like track what happened for them and make meaning around it. So those are some of the things that we heard from folks who chose to be involved in it. And what we heard afterwards was that actually a lot of that was really met by the circle process, and a few people sort of named like, wow, I did not expect that witnessing people in accountability would be so in service of my healing. I did not expect to be surprised by my ability to have compassion. I did not expect sort of how much I really needed to know that people were trying to be accountable, because in my case, that wasn't what was happening. And so those are and it's hard sort of to say broadly what everyone's feelings were, because there really was a array, and there was also sort of questions around like, people are doing this beautiful accountability work in the prison, and how do we know they'll do it when they come home? And we had to have a lot of discussions about the fact that we don't know, and that we can't deliver on that promise, and neither can the criminal legal system, right? And neither can so many other options out there, because it's ultimately about individuals and communities, but that we can really plant the seeds to move forward, and folks felt really moved by that. Yeah, so I'm gonna actually just leave it at that, and we can get into more questions if those come up around that. I think what Priya and I really quickly wanted to end on is just a couple of sort of steps that people can take toward doing this kind of work in their own organizations or in their own communities or from wherever they're currently housed and located. And so we wanted to just ask people sort of the steps that anti-violence organizations can take to learn and do more, and to be more engaged in the work. So I think the first thing we want to say is just the reminder that we've said a couple times now, that this is a compass, not a map. So it's not about replicating programs. It's not about creating programs. It's not about any sort of like specific steps that need to be taken, but really about thinking about the culture and values of the organizations we're a part of, or the communities we're a part of, and shifting if shifting needs to happen.
Yeah, so I think for us, what we really wanted to invite you all to think about a few questions, and specifically looking at you yourself as an individual human. What are your identities? What is your relationship to this work, to prison systems, to the criminal system, and also same for your organization, right? So what impact can you have where you are today? And so we kind of thought of a few things you could think of, starting with kind of an assessment, right? Of like, where are you at and where's your organization at? So thinking about like, what options are you providing for survivors as a first step? Do you want me to do all of them? Yep. We also, great. When thinking about safety and justice, what do you really mean, right? What does your organization really mean when talking about these? We just got a question saying, can we type these into the chat box? Yes, that would be a great idea. We will definitely do that. Martina's doing that now. The third one is thinking, how can we increase our work with family members, friends, and community members of survivors? I know that that has been like a conversation happening for a long time, and I think we grapple with that a lot at API Chaya, and just how important it is, right? Like, what are we doing to scale up all the folks in our community, because we know survivors are everywhere. And I think the last thing that we invite folks to think about is, what survivors are we centering in our services, in who our services are catered towards, in our advocacy, in our policy work, and in the narratives that we use, right? Like, whose voice, identity, and story gets to be at the center, and who is left out in the way that we talk about this.
Yeah, and I think in terms of like that question around the narrative that's being uplifted, in terms of the policy, there's so much policy work that's happening. Tommaso is involved in a lot in Olympia, and we've been a little bit this year, and I think that we're really interested in thinking about ways to build coalitions with seemingly unlikely allies that are actually, in fact, have shared interests, right? So that we're not working in silos, but instead thinking about always holding that question of how we can address interpersonal violence and address state violence at the same time, and that our policies are doing that, right? That in any question that we have around advocacy work, that we're really holding both of those, and that then invites us into a space of like-minded folks across the sectors that we work in to build really bold, powerful policy and organizing that can really look like our visions of safety and liberation, and not just mimic the logics of the state, right? And so that's an invitation sort of broadly to think about policy work, and I think more specifically, like, we really want to say to reach out to ourselves and other folks doing this work to start thinking through what that might look like.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, really, at the end of the day, it's about starting having these conversations. You know, listen to this webinar together at work. Think about, where is there agreement and where is there tension? Because there's always going to be tension. And, like, spend some time thinking about that and talking about that. Mapping, what are the real barriers? These are some of the steps we took at API Chaya over, like, years to get to this point, right, where this is, like, a big part of one of our strategic priorities and a big part of our work. So thinking about, where's there agreement, where's there tension, and what information, skills, and tools do you need to move forward? And I think definitely at that point, that's a place that Martina and I, or like the Community Justice Project broadly, can be really helpful, or can offer some things around skills, tools, assessments, other trainings, all those kinds of things.
So we are going to wrap, because we're at 11:40 and we had planned to end at 11:30. And so we want to make sure we have some time here for questions. But we really appreciate everybody taking the time to hear us and to sort of hear our thoughts and our frameworks and our questions around these issues. We want to spend some time answering, and it looks like 2 questions have already come in. So we'll start with those. Actually, a little more than that. And then feel free to just keep asking them as we go. And if we don't get to them, we can definitely have follow-up. So the first question that I'm going to answer is around the question about doing this deep accountability work with people who've caused harm that are not already fully adjudicated for it, right? So Priya and I talked about this often over the past 2 years, that we really didn't want to do the work initially in the prisons. Like, what we don't want to do is sort of normalize prison as a site for healing, right, and accountability, when so often it's the opposite. And yet, there are some real advantages, right? Like, we have an audience that is, like, sticking with us for 15 months every week. And Priya and I talked a lot about, like, how difficult that would have been in the community to do, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a real question, right? Like, what do we do on the front end? And what I will say is that there are lots of folks out there that are doing this work, and I think we're really interested in doing it as well. I know Priya does a lot of community accountability work where the legal system is not triggered at all. And there's also a fair amount of work that's happening around diversion. So when someone is, when 911 is called, when an arrest is made, and someone is facing time for harm that's been, that they've been involved in, and there is a survivor who's really interested and open to a response that looks different than sort of the traditional criminal legal system, that something else can happen. And so I think I'll just name really quickly, Common Justice is an organization in New York that does post-arrest post-filing, which means the prosecutor's office does file a case, but pre-trial diversion for young people between the ages of 17 and 24 who's caused very serious harm, so violent felonies, and they get diverted out of the criminal legal system, and instead of serving time in prison, which they would likely serve for the crimes that they've committed, they spend about 15 months in an accountability and healing circle with Confinement Justice. And in that case, I think the person who's been harmed has to opt in, right? So they have to say, I want this. And then both the survivor and the person who's caused harm receive resources and support. So that's a really great one to look into. And Sujatha Valiga in the Bay Area has done a lot of work around sort of diversion for restorative justice when serious harm occurs. And I know that the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office has done some that you could look into, and there's really different models for all of those. And that question around sort of risk for someone to admit harm when they're facing potential criminal consequences is a real one. And usually what ends up happening if the system is already engaged, right, if it's not a community accountability process, but instead embedded in the criminal legal system in some way, there's usually some kind of like MOU and agreement that what happens in that circle will remain in that circle, so confidentiality. It's the same thing that often happens when someone does a pretrial diversion. So I, for example, received a diversion and I had to essentially like admit to what happened, and they held that and agreed not to file it. And I think that like in that case, the prosecutors actually saw it, and in some of the RJ circles, nobody will see that except for the facilitators involved, right? So there's various models for how that can be protected.
And I think just purely on the community end, I think it's a short answer, but the answer, I mean, yes, it is a risk. I think, right? And when I facilitate circles out in the community in response to harm that happens when there's no police involvement, one, if there is a criminal case, we usually won't do a process because that risk is so high. So yeah, I mean, I think, and we have everybody agree to like not use this information for the purposes of a prosecution. I think it just speaks again to somehow like, you know, often that process has an inverse relationship to accountability.
Yeah, I think that risk is always there for sure.
Yeah.
There's another question here about the New Zealand model. So New Zealand has a model called family group conferencing that's used. It is mandatory as the first option for young people who've committed violence with the survivor or victim's consent. And the question is, do you think it's an easier sell here in the US to start with youth? And my answer is yes. And there's a reason that most of the restorative justice diversion work that's happened nationally has happened in the juvenile context. So yes, I think it is. And my personal, this is not representative of the Community Justice Project necessarily, but my personal view on it is that actually that can be a group that is also risky, right? So when you think about what restorative justice can provide and the kinds of resources that are available, if a young person is in a home where violence is occurring or where there's a great deal of instability, there's actually like not much that folks can do about it from the restorative justice lens. And I think when there are young adults, right, like people who might be more independent who are causing harm, there's actually in ways that there's more that can be done, right? So it's like again, possible to provide a housing voucher. And the population that is both the drivers of long-term sentencing and serious violent crime is 17 to 24-year-old men. And that's also the same population that is the most likely to experience violence. And that is not including sexual violence and domestic violence in that case, but sort of robberies and assaults and gun violence is 17 to 24-year-old men. And so actually I think the place where we can really have the most impact is young people for sure, and not necessarily just youth. So we're trying to really expand the narrative about who's deserving of support, because it's often young adults. But I do think it's an easier sell to say youth. I mean, I think that's why it's happening globally.
And I think that's part of why, like, Martina and I felt like it was really important to actually focus, on, like, adults who are, like, fully making choices for themselves, right? Because, in my experience as a survivor, this is what I would have wanted to. Like, I think there's the idea of the easier sell, and I talk to people every day who come through API Chaya who say, like, I want something like this. And, I know we talked a little bit before about how it's actually, like, best suited for a very serious harm that happens, like the transformation that's possible there. So I mean, again, you're so right that it's an easier sell, and I think I'm inviting us all to like actually lean into the nuance of that a little bit and say like it would work for adults as well. And like I think that's a lot of our information and resources today. We're focused on like not youth really, but adults.
I think the last thing about that is that, and this goes much broader than restorative justice, but in general, what we're seeing in the criminal justice reform movement really is a lot more movement around sort of low-level crime, young people, less serious harm, and what Danielle Sered says is we're sort of in legislation and in policy work and in our narratives, we're sort of trimming the tree branches of criminal justice reform while we're simultaneously watering its roots, right? So when we do that, when we say like this is the group that's deserving of support and this is the group that is not, we're actually really redefining the very group that is the most targeted by the justice system to begin with. So we're really expanding resources to address violence in the criminal legal system. We're really expanding sort of the categories that are considered violent and the length of time that people are serving for violent crime while we're trimming down the smaller stuff. And so in that way, we really don't believe that justice like can trickle down, but instead that what we're really called to do is start really grappling with the most serious harm in the cases that are the least palatable, right? And if we do that, if we find something that works in those contexts, we'll really find something that works for everyone. Okay. Are there any other questions? You can ask it on that.
You could type it in. Tommaso had one, and I basically was like, no, I don't want to answer that.
I think Tommaso had a question around like the tensions between transformative justice, restorative justice, and community accountability. And I think the one thing that we will say is that in many ways there's a lot of shared values and shared practices inside of each of these, and there is tensions and differences in terms of where they came from. So the sort of movements that restorative justice evolved inside of and the movements that transformative justice and community accountability came about inside of are different. And the last thing I'll say is that I think with transformative justice and community accountability, there's really shared politics inside of them. And with restorative justice, there very much can be, and it's not necessary that there is. So you'll find folks that are doing restorative justice work with really differing political views, but maybe using a lot of the shared sort of tools and frameworks for it. And some of that overlaps with TJ and community accountability. Within TJ and community accountability, you'll find folks maybe using different tools, but with shared values. And so I guess that's all I'll name. I think it's the most sort of important difference. We've got about 10 minutes left if anyone has any more questions or comments.
And you know, if there are places that you feel like there's tension or things we haven't talked about that feel like big disagreements for you, like we're so open, so.
Oh, there's a question right here.
Oh, sorry, we missed one before. What was the second part of accountability that you talked about? The first one was sitting with the harm that you caused. Yeah, I think we think about accountability as kind of a multiple steps around it. I think first was like building up our capacity to feel emotions, which is what allows us to actually like sit in the impacts of the harm that we caused. And another part of that is connecting, like understanding how and why we got to the place where we caused that harm. So we talk about it kind of as connecting the dots of our life around like thinking about the abuse that we might have experienced as a child, how we dealt with that, like what our trauma responses were, how that led to more violence or us causing harm, how toxic masculinity is related, how grief is related, right? So like really doing all the work to unpeel all of those layers to see what is the harm actually, like how did I get to a place where I caused this harm? And unless you really take those steps, you can't make a good plan moving forward of like how not to make that choice again, right? So like living with the impact, and that takes a lot of skills and building empathy and understanding how and why we got there and making a plan to not do that again.
There's another question here, or two more questions here. One is around the process of empathy building. So for folks who caused harm, I'm wondering if there was a shift or change from the initial understanding of harm caused in the accountability letter, in terms of how it impacted themselves and their own lives, and then how that impacted the person they harmed.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, so I'll start with the first piece around like the process of empathy building. And I think the first is that it's not the case that the folks that we worked with who caused harm weren't capable of empathizing, right? Like it's not actually the case that there were people inside that weren't feeling feelings and didn't have any level of empathy. What I do think is true, is that it is very difficult to deepen that level of accountability when someone hasn't been witnessed in the harm that they've experienced as well. And it's this really difficult balance of, right, like we often talk about like not colluding with violence and not excusing violence, and also the reality that if we understand trauma healing as being essential to accountability, that there has to be space made for someone to do that work. And so an example I'm thinking of is the person in one of our groups who, when we gave the accountability letter, said, I'm not going to write it. And we're like, why don't you just sit with it? And every single person in that group wrote their letter and shared their letter. And this is a process of like 2 months alone just in sharing, because it took like an hour and a half for each person to share. And so with 10 people in the room, that meant like we were sitting in circle sharing deep accountability letters for about 2 months. And when it got to this person in our circle who had been very resistant, he said he didn't feel like he could share it because last time he'd said how he felt about it, he got kicked out of the program he was in. And so we had a long conversation about whether or not that would happen. And then he finally said, you know, the reason that I'm worried about that happening is because, you know, I don't feel bad that I did it and I would do it again. And he was serving a long sentence from when he was a juvenile for a murder. And it like sort of took the air out of the room when he said that. And a lot of folks got really upset with him, including a lot of the elders in the room who were in circle doing their own accountability work. And finally, one of the facilitators said sort of like, well, why? Why do you feel that way? And he named that the person that he had harmed had that gang, the gang that person was a part of, had been responsible for the death of his father and his cousin and his best friend and like every other man in his life. And that he'd been born into a gang, like he became part of the gang that he was a part of at age 6, and that was his whole life, and he'd lost everyone. And all of the facilitator said was sort of like an acknowledgement that was a lot to hold, right? She just said like, wow, that is a lot to carry. And then he just like immediately burst into tears and sort of, you know, then the bell rang and everyone had to leave, and he came back the next week and he was like, okay, I don't know what kind of voodoo mind tricks you guys just played on me, but I did my accountability letter, and I really do want to be accountable, and I didn't mean what I said. And in my accountability letter, I'm also going to talk about harm I've experienced, and then I'm going to talk about harm I've caused, as if like he came to that on his own, and we're like, yes, that's what the questions ask. But thank you for that, right? And then he had this really, like, he did incredible work for the next few months before he got transferred out of the prison, and he actually like dropped out of his gang a few months later, and that's why he had to get transferred. And so I think that piece around empathy is, I really don't want the narrative to be that people don't have it, but instead that a deepening into it requires that we really sit with each other in the hard stuff that we've experienced as well. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think absolutely a huge shift. Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes. I don't know. Do you want to say anything, Tomasa?
Just a few seconds at the end, so okay. There's no more questions.
Okay.
We've got one about, will the presentation be sent out?
Yes.
I feel good about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we got another one. How do we move towards restorative justice and addressing the conditions as a community that lead to folks causing harm without survivors and individuals feel like we are blaming them?
Yeah. That's
been my fear question around to broach this when working with survivors who are so angry and can't see beyond punishment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really real, right? And we talked before about the difference between like survivor-led and survivor-centered. And I think what I have found in this process is that like we can create meaningful space for people to like express their very justified like anger, emotions, which are so normal, right? Like really providing an outlet for that and holding that really deeply, and then still being able to lean into like a values-based process. Like I think in general, we've actually kind of found that to mostly work. It's like, you know, people want to like vent and let things out. And when we can show them and we can say like, yes, absolutely, you are right, that is awful. Maybe that should happen, right? And just like honor their feelings in that space. And then also say, and like, here's all the work that we are actually doing with the person who caused harm. Like, and this is why I have found like that actually really helps people shift, because the survivors who want this kind of process are the ones who are already like a little bit ready for that. Right? And it's not going to be right for everybody. Just like we said, this is about increasing options for people. It's not about taking away any options.
I think the thing I totally agree with that. I think the thing I would add also is that one thing that we did, I think similar to how in the prisons we talked a lot about both doing some kind of trauma healing work, right, and trauma-informed work. We also did a lot of political education, right? So we did political education around toxic masculinity. We also did a lot of work around understanding the context of structural and state violence. And we did the same thing on the survivor side. So when we worked with folks who experienced violence, we both did grief work and deep trauma healing work, and also really actually named what our sort of framework and analysis was around how interpersonal violence happens in the context of state violence. Mm-hmm. And actually what that did for people was part of the meaning making, right? Like for folks who experience violence and can't understand like why and how this happened, to really understand that it's set up this way, I think in many ways, like here's the context of which that violence to you and your family occurred, actually provided a lot of language tools, history, frameworks to really name the experience that people had that felt so isolating and made it less isolating, right? Like to break that isolation and understand that there's a relationship inside of that, and that there's a broader context with which it occurred, I think was a real positive thing, and then kind of set the stage to think more broadly about what it means to like move that.
And we're going to pass it over to Tommaso, and I think the only last thing I'll say around that too is, so often when people are like, I want to never see this person again, or I want punishment for them, I think just getting curious about like, what does that take care of for you, right? Because our current system is kind of like, they're either banished or they're in my life and there's no consequences. So really getting at like, what are the goals that you really have, and like, what is the best way to get at it has also been a really helpful conversation. Like if you want them to never be around you again, what is it that you're worried about? What is that, what is that taking care of for you? And maybe there's a better way to get there. I've also had that conversation a lot of times.
Me too, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I don't know,
Yeah, thank you so much for spending the last 2 hours with us and being in this conversation. We really appreciate Tommaso and WSCADV for giving us this platform. We hope to talk with all of you more.
Yes, thanks everybody. Thanks to, I'll move into the middle here. Thanks Priya and Martina for joining us, and thank you all for joining us as well. Just wanted to say a few quick words. We're going to send out a link to the recording of this webinar so that you can share it with colleagues if you want. Folks who registered but weren't able to join will be able to watch. That email and the post on our website with the video will also have links to the resources, some resources that were mentioned during the webinar, and some other resources that might be helpful and people didn't think of off the top of their head. The other things I wanted to say, so, a few things that were mentioned throughout the course of the webinar. One thing was the idea that so often friends and family are, in fact, the first responders for domestic and sexual violence. And so I wanted to put a plug in. One of the new things that we have put out as an organization is a Friends and Family Guide. So this is kind of expanding on our work over the years to equip friends and family of survivors with tools to support folks and also support those who might be in your life who might be doing harm as well. So look for that on our website, the Friends and Family Guide. Another thing I wanted to say is that if you're interested in these conversations, I invite you to join us at our annual conference, which will be in Spokane this year from on September 23rd and 24th. The theme of the conference is Injustice for All. So it's going to be looking at the ways that organizations and individuals, survivors in our communities, define justice. And I think we're planning and hoping to have a lot of content that touches on justice beyond the criminal justice system, including restorative justice and other alternative modalities. The last thing I just wanted to say is that I know that there's a lot, this stuff is important and these are challenging conversations. So thank you for being willing to join us and bearing with us through this. I think that a lot of these conversations bring up uncomfortable feelings, and that's actually, that we think that that's a good thing. And so just to say that if you aren't totally sure how you feel about all this, or if you're still digesting some of these ideas, I think that's valuable. We're just hoping to present a forum for folks to be able to be exposed to some of these ideas. Sujata Balaga, who was mentioned, I originally was first exposed to thinking about restorative justice meaningfully in domestic and sexual violence situations through a presentation that I saw her give 5 or 6 years ago now at this point. And fast forward to 2019 and the new authorization of the Violence Against Women Act that just passed the House includes some language on alternative justice responses that incorporates some of the thinking that her and other folks in the movement have been doing on this. So just to say that this is a great time. If you have a lot of questions and ideas about this is a great time to learn more, and we hope you stay engaged in the conversation. So thank you for joining us, and have a good day.